Rebirth is participation in the process of transformation. What really dies when you change? We often believe it's the job we lost, the relationship that ended, the version of ourselves that no longer fits. But beneath every ending, there's something quieter happening, something most of us avoid looking at. It's not just the loss of what was. It's the death of the identity that kept it alive. And that death hurts because it feels like disappearing. You look around and nothing looks the same. You feel suspended between who you were and who you're supposed to become. It's like standing in the silence after a storm. Everything's still, yet somehow full of invisible movement. That silence is an emptiness. It's gestation. Jung once said that what we call death is often the necessary destruction of an old attitude of the soul. He didn't speak of death and rebirth as physical events, but as transformations of the psyche, natural, rhythmic, inevitable. Every winter of the soul prepares the ground for new life. Yet we resist it. We cling to what's dying because it gives us a sense of control, of continuity. The ego says, if I can just hold it together a little longer, maybe I won't have to face the unknown. But the self, the deeper, wiser center within us, whispers something else. Let it fall apart. You're not losing yourself. You're being reshaped. Imagine a tree in the heart of winter. From the outside, it looks lifeless. Branches stripped bare, color drained. But inside, unseen roots are drawing energy, gathering strength for spring. The tree doesn't mourn its leaves. It trusts the cycle. Yet when we enter our own winters, when relationships end, when dreams collapse, when we outgrow old versions of ourselves, we mistake stillness for death. We forget that life often hides beneath what seems lost. The psyche knows this rhythm better than we do. It knows that to be reborn, something must first dissolve. Those quiet dissolutions, the job you didn't get, the friend who walked away, the belief that no longer sustains you, are not punishments. They are psychic initiations. They strip away everything false so that what is real can breathe again. Jung believed that the self uses crisis as language. When life takes something from us, it's rarely cruelty. It's communication. It's the soul saying, you can't carry the identity any further. That's why rebirth doesn't begin with light or clarity. It begins with surrender. But the mind rebels. It wants resurrection without the tomb, transformation without the pain of letting go. It asks, why can't I just skip to the part where I'm whole again? Yet in nature, nothing skips the dark. Even the seed must crack before it can sprout. Even dawn must first be preceded by night. Maybe what's ending for you now isn't your life falling apart. It's your old skin peeling away, making space for a truer form. Every soul, Jung said, walks this path, the descent into darkness, the encounter with the shadow, and eventual rising toward integration. Death and rebirth aren't two separate events. They're one continuous motion. The deeper you fall into the unknown, the closer you come to the source of renewal. That's why silence after an ending feels so heavy. It's not absence, it's preparation. Something unseen is organizing itself inside you, waiting for your permission to emerge. So before you rush to fix, to replace, to resurrect, pause. Listen to that sacred stillness between what ended and what hasn't begun. It's there that the self rearranges your inner world, taking what broke and transforming it into new meaning. It's there that the next chapter begins to breathe, long before you can see its first word. But what if the death you fear the most isn't an ending at all? What if it's the deepest calling of your soul? The ego dies quietly, not with a scream, but with a silence so deep it echoes. Jung wrote that the ego must die so that the self, the totality of who we are, conscious and unconscious, can emerge. The ego is the mask we wear to navigate the world. The storyteller that believes it's running the show. It builds careers, collects titles, and calls the result me. But when life begins to strip away those roles, the ego panics. It confuses change with annihilation. It can't imagine existing without its familiar identities. And yet, every true transformation begins exactly there, where control collapses and something larger begins to move through us. Take, for instance, a man who loses his job after 20 years. At first, he does what everyone expects, updates his resume, forces optimism, repeats to himself that he'll bounce back. But the truth is he can't. Not yet, because beneath the surface of his loss lies a deeper story. His identity wasn't built on purpose, but on performance. He wasn't just earning a living. He was earning the right to exist. When the structure that defined him fell, he met the emptiness beneath it. The voice that once said, "You are what you do," grew silent. And in that silence, something unfamiliar whispered back, "If you are not what you do, then who are you?" That question is a threshold Jung called the descent into the unconscious. It's not a downward spiral into despair. It's an initiation as old as humanity itself. In ancient rites, initiates symbolically died before being reborn into a new life. Their old names were erased, their past stripped away, their former selves buried, so the deeper self could awaken. The psyche still follows that same ritual, though now the temple is within us. Every breakdown, every loss, every ending, these are modern initiations, demanding that the ego step aside so something timeless can take its place. We resist this death because the ego believes survival means control. It tries to fix, to rationalize, to rebuild its kingdom of certainty. But the self isn't asking for control, it's asking for surrender. When life removes the roles that once defined us, it's not punishment, it's preparation. The man who lost his job thought his purpose ended with his title. What he didn't see was that the title had become a cage. Only by losing it could he begin to hear his own soul again. The outer loss revealed an inner captivity. The walls that once made him feel safe were the same walls, keeping him small. How many times have you tried to save a part of yourself that had already served its purpose? How often have you clung to a version of you that the soul had already outgrown? We fight to keep things alive because we confuse familiarity with meaning. But Jung warned that the greater danger lies not in dying, but in refusing to transform. What we do not bring to consciousness, he said, appears in our lives as fate. When the ego refuses to release its old form, life steps in as a sculptor, breaking away what no longer belongs. This inner death isn't about destruction. It's about making room. The ego must dissolve for the self to breathe through us. It's like clearing ashes so the hidden flame can rise again. The man who thought he'd lost everything eventually realized he hadn't lost his life. He'd lost his illusion of control. What died wasn't his path. It was his image of who he thought he had to be. And in the ruins of that false certainty, he found something quieter, vaster, more real, presence. We all enter that darkness at some point, whether through heartbreak, loss, or failure. The pattern is the same. Something ends so the soul can speak. It's terrifying because the ego doesn't know that rebirth is waiting. It only knows how to cling. It prays for resurrection while resisting the grave. But the deeper intelligence of the psyche knows. Only through descent do we find the source of renewal. So what really happens inside us when the old begins to die? Transformation doesn't begin with willpower. It begins when the unconscious decides it's time to rebalance what the ego has ignored. Jung observed that when consciousness becomes too one-sided, too rational, too controlled, too afraid of its own depths, the unconscious compensates. It starts sending signals, dreams that disturb, emotions that surge out of nowhere, sudden losses that strip away illusion. These aren't accidents. They're corrections. The psyche, like nature, will always seek equilibrium. And when the ego refuses to listen, life speaks louder. We like to think we can silence what we don't want to feel. Anger, envy, desire, grief. We bury them under productivity, spirituality, politeness. But what's repressed doesn't vanish. It waits. Beneath the surface, those energies continue to live, gathering strength, shaping our choices from the shadows. Jung called this the compensatory function of the unconscious, the hidden mechanism of transformation. It's not there to punish us. It's there to restore wholeness. Every dream that unsettles you, every emotional storm you can't explain, every loss that forces humility, each is a psyche's attempt to heal the imbalance created by a consciousness that has forgotten its roots. That's where the transcendent function comes in, the bridge between the known and the unknown. Jung described it as a living dialogue between the conscious mind and the unconscious depths, a conversation that gives birth to a third thing, a higher synthesis that neither side could reach alone. When we stop fighting the parts of ourselves we fear and start listening to them, a new level of awareness begins to emerge. It's not about choosing between shadow and light, control or surrender. It's about allowing both to speak until they form a new language of the soul. In The Nature of the Psyche, Jung wrote, "Life has to be conquered again and again. Man needs difficulties. They are necessary for his health. Every challenge, every descent, every dark night of the soul is part of that ongoing conquest. Difficulty is not the enemy, it's the forge. Without tension, there is no growth. Without conflict, there is no synthesis. The psyche evolves through friction, just as muscles strengthen through resistance. Crisis is simply the soul's way of demanding movement, where we become static. Think of the moments when everything fell apart. The breakup that shattered your illusions of love, the illness that forced you to rest, the failure that humbled your pride. Each carried a message from the unconscious. Something within you is ready to change. We often experience these turning points as chaos, but underneath the surface, order is being rebuilt. The very forces we label as breakdown are, in truth, breakthroughs disguised as pain. Dreams, too, serve the sacred mechanism. They translate the voice of the unconscious into symbols the conscious mind can slowly understand. A flood representing emotion long held back, a burning house symbolizing transformation, a forgotten child waiting to be acknowledged. When we learn to read these images, we participate in our own evolution. The transcendent function isn't theory. It's an experience of rebirth through awareness. It's the moment when the self we thought we were meets the self that's been waiting beneath every difficulty. Transformation, then, is not something we perform. It's something we allow. It unfolds naturally when we stop identifying with one half of our being and open ourselves to dialogue with the other. The ego dissolves its rigidity. The unconscious softens its storms. And together they give rise to a consciousness more whole than before. But what happens when we resist this transformation? There is a danger in refusing to die, at least symbolically. When the ego resists dissolution, when it clings to its old forms and identities, the psyche begins to protest. Jung saw it countless times in his patients. People caught in that twilight space between what has ended and what has not yet begun. They weren't sick in the physical sense. They were suspended between death and rebirth. They couldn't return to who they once were, but they were too afraid to become who they were meant to be. And the psyche, unable to move forward, began to create pressure inside them. Anxiety, numbness, depression, not as punishment, but as the soul's last attempt to force an awakening. Imagine a butterfly refusing to leave its cocoon. It clings to the walls that once protected it, unaware that staying inside will suffocate it. The same shell that nurtured its growth now threatens its existence. That's what happens when we try to preserve the ego past its season. What was once necessary becomes poison. What once offered safety becomes confinement. Transformation demands movement, but the ego prefers repetition. It wants the security of what it already knows. The psyche, however, is not interested in comfort. It seeks wholeness. Jung described this state vividly in the ego and the unconscious. He observed that when the conscious and unconscious fall into conflict and no reconciliation occurs, the individual becomes paralyzed. The conscious mind loses vitality, and the unconscious, unable to find expression, turns inward, manifesting as fatigue, emptiness, and loss of meaning. The person feels as though life has withdrawn its energy. That inner standstill is not death, but a refusal to be reborn. The self waits patiently behind the walls of resistance, holding the blueprint for renewal, yet cannot act until the ego releases control. Every symptom, every restless night, every ache that logic can't explain is a message from the depths. You cannot stay here. Depression, in Jungian terms, isn't always an enemy. It's the gravity of transformation, pulling you down to where your new life begins. The descent feels like failure, but it's actually initiation. The psyche dismantles what no longer serves to prepare the space for something authentic. But if we keep patching the cracks, pretending nothing is breaking, we miss the miracle waiting underneath. In this in-between state, people often describe feeling like ghosts inside their own lives. Work loses meaning. Relationships feel hollow. Even joy becomes mechanical. That's the cost of resisting the inner movement. The soul is ready to speak, but the ego keeps turning up the noise. Jung wrote that such stagnation isolates the person from the living flow of the unconscious. It's like cutting the roots of a tree and wondering why the leaves wither. The outer world may still see a functioning person, but inside, life has slowed to a whisper. To heal, we must allow the old identity to dissolve. Even when it feels like death, we must trust that what's being stripped away is not the essence of who we are, but the mask that hid it, like the butterfly. We must endure the pressure of cocoon breaking open, trusting that the pain of release is not the end. It's the beginning of flight. The danger isn't in dying to the old self. It's in refusing to. The longer we resist, the more the psyche intensifies its call, turning quiet discomfort into full collapse until we surrender. And yet, surrender is not defeat, it's alignment. It's the moment the river stops fighting its course and begins to flow again. The ego bows, the unconscious rises, and life resumes its rhythm. Still, many fear the surrender, imagining it as oblivion. They ask, if the soul truly leads us through this death, where does it take us next? Every soul that dares to transform walks through the same 4 doors. Jung mapped them with the precision of both a scientist and a mystic. The first is recognition, that moment when life stops cooperating with the story you've been telling. Something breaks, a relationship, a routine, a certainty. The ego calls it failure, but the soul calls it invitation. You begin to sense that the crisis is not punishment, but a signal. Your psyche trying to restore balance. Jung said the first act of consciousness is simply to see, to stop blaming the outer world long enough to ask, why is this happening within me? That question, asked sincerely, opens the way. The second stage is descent, the dark night, the confrontation with the shadow. This is where the rejected emotions return. Anger you buried under politeness, grief you disguised as strength, envy you denied in the name of virtue. They rise from the depths not to destroy you, but to reintroduce you to your own wholeness. In ancient myth, this was a hero's underworld journey. Jung saw it not as metaphor, but as psychological truth. The descent into the unconscious is necessary for renewal. You can't integrate what you refuse to face. The self asks for honesty, not perfection. Then comes integration, the sacred union of opposites. Here, you learn that light without shadow is not purity, but denial. You begin to see that every quality you admire hides its counterpart. Your kindness has traces of anger. Your strength depends on vulnerability. Jung called this reconciliation the function of opposites, and it is the essence of individuation. As consciousness holds tension between the poles, a new synthesis emerges. The opposites no longer fight. They begin to dance. This is where healing happens, not in choosing sides, but in embracing paradox. Finally, there is rebirth, not a return to who you were, but a recreation of who you are becoming. Life starts to move through you instead of against you. You no longer chase meaning. You embody it. You act, speak, and choose from the center that feels ancient and alive, the self. Jung called this alchemical. The lead of suffering becomes the gold of consciousness. He described it simply. Rebirth is participation in the process of transformation. The old form dissolves, but the essence endures, shining brighter for having been through the fire. In this stage, the ordinary becomes sacred. Writing becomes confession. Silence becomes communion. A walk becomes a dialogue with the world. These are not small gestures. They're the micro-actions through which the transcendent function operates. When you journal your dreams, you're decoding the letters your unconscious sends to guide you. When you sit in stillness, instead of reaching for distraction, you let the self breathe. When you walk slowly, aware of each step, you ground your rebirth in the body, turning spiritual insight into lived experience. The path is not linear, it spirals. You'll revisit the same lessons, but each time from a higher vantage point. You'll lose yourself again and again, and each time, the self will find you with deeper compassion. Transformation is not about becoming invincible. It's about becoming real. The alchemist's furnace isn't meant to destroy, but to refine. Every moment of surrender burns away illusion until only essence remains. And yet, even here at the threshold of rebirth, a new danger appears. The ego, clever as ever, watches this transformation and whispers, "Look how evolved you become. Look how awakened you are." It starts to rebuild its throne, disguising pride as enlightenment, control as purpose. And if we're not careful, the rebirth itself becomes another mask, another prison made of light. Because even the act of awakening can be corrupted if the ego tries to take the place of self. The greatest danger after awakening is believing you're done. Many reach the light and mistake the glow for completion, not realizing that every illumination casts a new shadow. Jung warned that after the ego survives its symbolic death, it often comes back wearing spiritual clothes. It speaks softly now, quotes sacred texts, and calls it self-aware. But in truth, it's the same voice that once demanded control, only now it demands reverence. This is the first trap of false rebirth, ego inflation. It's the subtle belief that because you've seen the depths, you are somehow above them. You start to measure yourself against others, to compare awakenings, to preach instead of listen. The moment spirituality becomes self-importance, the process of transformation freezes. What was meant to humble now begins to separate. You can see it everywhere. In influencers preaching peace while secretly addicted to validation, in gurus who build kingdoms out of followers, in everyday seekers who believe that awareness exempts them from being human. The tragedy isn't that they've failed, it's that they've stopped transforming. Real growth is quiet. It doesn't announce itself. The truly awakened person rarely speaks of awakening because they know how fragile it is. One moment of pride can undo years of integration. The second trap is the savior complex, the belief that now that you've seen the light, your mission is to rescue everyone else from their darkness. It feels noble, but often it's avoidance disguised as compassion. You heal others so you don't have to face what still hurts inside you. Jung saw this as projection, the ego casting its unhealed parts onto the world and trying to fix them externally. Real service begins only when you've made peace with your own shadow. Until then, you're just transferring your war. Then there's spiritual isolation, confusing detachment with enlightenment. You withdraw from the world, convinced that solitude equals sanctity. You stop engaging with people because their pain feels lower vibration. But Jung knew that true individuation doesn't remove you from life. It roots you more deeply in it. To be spiritual is not to escape the human condition, but to embrace it with eyes open. The mystic who cannot laugh, cry, or love has not transcended. They've numbed. In psychology and religion, Jung described religion not as dogma, but as direct experience. Religion is a careful observation of what Rudolf Otto called the numinosum, something that seizes and dominates the human subject. The numinous isn't belief, it's an encounter, something that humbles, not elevates, the ego. When the divine touches you, it doesn't make you feel powerful, it makes you kneel. It's the awareness that something infinitely greater is moving through you, and you are merely its vessel. The true rebirth, then, is not about superiority, it's about surrender. It's realizing that awakening isn't a destination, but a continuous dying. Every time the ego rebuilds itself, life will gently or violently dismantle again. Enlightenment isn't a crown, it's a crucible. It's the willingness to die countless small deaths, silently unseen, so that something pure can keep being born within you. So when you meet someone who claims they've arrived, look closer. The self doesn't boast, it breathes. It doesn't divide, it unites. Real transformation leaves you softer, not louder, more human, not more holy. And in the end, when the ego finally surrenders its crown and steps aside, something wordless begins to rise from within. It's not the self you imagined. It's the one that has always been watching, patient and eternal. The question is, when the ego finally yields, what is it that truly comes alive in its place? Every true dawn begins in darkness. The night never disappears because it's defeated. It dissolves because it's been understood. That's how rebirth really happens. Not by fleeing for what hurts, but by looking directly into it until you see your reflection in the dark. Every ending, every silence, every heartbreak is a kind of initiation. The soul dies to illusion so that truth can live. And when that truth rises, it does so quietly, like the first breath after drowning. The ego, trembling, believes this is the end. It fights to keep its fire alive, terrified of disappearing. But what really burns out is not your life. It's the illusion of control, The mind's old stories, the masks you wore to survive, the borrowed identities, they fall away like ash. And in the center of all that emptiness, something flickers. A single spark, almost invisible, begins to glow. That spark is a self. The part of you that has never been wounded, never been broken, never been lost. It is the eternal witness, waiting patiently beneath every storm of your becoming. Imagine a flame in the middle of a vast night. It doesn't rage against the dark. It learns to illuminate it. That's the paradox of transformation. The fire that once destroyed now becomes a light that guides. The rebirth of the self is like that. A light rekindled not outside, but within. It's not about becoming someone new. It's about remembering who you've always been. Every fall, every failure, every loss was a descent back to that center, the silent place where life begins again. Jung understood that the psyche reveals this mystery through symbols, the secret language of the soul. In The Man and His Symbols, he wrote that dreams are the bridge between the conscious and unconscious, nightly messages from the depths, showing us where our soul is trying to heal. A dream of death rarely means destruction. It is the image of transformation, the old pattern breaking apart, so that new meaning can emerge. When we ignore these dreams, the messages turn into crises. When we listen, they become maps back to wholeness. The unconscious is always working toward balance, always trying to bring us home. You start to notice it. The synchronicities, the gentle nudges of life arranging things in ways too precise to be coincidence. The right person appears at the right time. A sentence from a stranger feels like prophecy. An ending you dreaded turns out to be your liberation. That's the self moving through you, orchestrating life with a wisdom the ego can't yet comprehend. The more you trust it, the more life stops feeling random and starts feeling sacred. Rebirth doesn't announce itself with fireworks. It comes as a subtle shift in how you breathe, how you listen, how you forgive. You stop trying to fix yourself and start letting yourself unfold. You realize that the light you were searching for was never at the end of the tunnel. It was inside you, waiting for you to open your eyes. It shines differently now, softer, steadier, grounded in humility. You've learned that enlightenment isn't escape. It's participation. It's saying yes to life in all its forms, even the painful ones, because now you understand. Every shadow you meet is another doorway to light. You become the sunrise after your own storm, not because the darkness is gone, but because you've learned to hold it with compassion. You carry your scars as symbols, not of defeat, but of rebirth, proof that you've walked through fire and found gold in the ashes. You start to live not as a seeker, but as a witness of the divine moving through ordinary moments, in the laughter of a child, in the stillness before sleep, in the quiet miracle of breathing. That's the true awakening Jung spoke of, the integration of all that you are, the sacred marriage between what is human and what is eternal. The rebirth of self is not a return to innocence, but the conscious realization of your own divinity. You see that you were never broken, only unfolding. The night no longer frightens you because you know that every darkness is carrying light within it, just waiting to be born through you. And so, as the final veil lifts, you understand one simple, eternal truth. Nothing really dies. It only changes forward within the soul. Comment below, I choose to be reborn in awareness.